Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and tonight's story actually comes to us from the US in the 1920s and 30s. It's one of the stories that actually inspired me to start the podcast in the first place, and one I think a lot of you will be familiar with. So I hope I do it justice, and more importantly, treat the victims with the respect and grace they deserve. This is the story of the Radium Girls. But first, a Victorian Society tip. Many of you likely already know that if you found yourself transported back in time to the 1920s in the US, working at the radium plant would not be somewhere you'd want to be. So, if we're not going to get a job at the radium plant, what other work was available to women in the 1920s? According to census data of the top 50 jobs that employed women in the US, if we're looking at other factory work, one of the most available jobs was working in the cotton or other textile mills. Often women could bring their children along to work, but not because there was on-site daycare provided, but because they would put the children to work too. Workers often had breathing problems due to the fibers flying around in the air, and it was easy to get a hand, hair, or clothing caught in the equipment. A step up from the cotton mill was the knitting mill, where women could do skilled or semi-skilled work, including transferring the tops of stockings onto circular knitting machines run by other women who would attach the feet of the stockings. Similar but more lucrative work could be found at the silk mill. Silkworm farming was a thing in the US, and the silk had to be cleaned, separated into skeins, wound into bobbins, twisted into yarn, and put on looms for weaving. Silk mills fell in especially hard times after the Great Depression, though, when cheaper synthetic fibers took over. Over at the cigar and tobacco factory, women worked in assembly lines inspecting tobacco leaves, rolling cigars, packing boxes, or applying labels. Technology advancements brought a boom in the printing, publishing, and engraving business, which led to an increase in catalog and mail order business, leading to more opportunities at the shoemaking, coat, overall, collar, cuff, and glove factories. These factories had more heavy machinery, though, and fire was a hazard. You may be familiar with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, where 146 garment workers lost their lives in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. Iron, steel, and machinery business was booming, producing everything from sewing machines to support all those garment factories, to typewriters, to railroad supplies, guns and ammunition, cars, airplanes, and more. If none of that appeals to you, you can try getting a job at the candy factory. Commercial candy production flourished in the 1920s and debuted a lot of favorites we still love today, including Mounds bars, Chuckles, Gummy Bears, the Charleston Chew, Baby Ruth bars, Milky Way bars, Mr. Good bar, Milk Duds, Heath bars, and Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. This work came with a lot of the same dangers and tedium as other factories, but it probably smelled better. Probably better than another option, the rubber factory anyway. These were all still paid relatively low for the time, though. Those looking for a step up could throw in for a number of newly created positions in the 1920s, including typists, filing clerks, stenographers, and even some secretarial roles. However, the job was still monotonous and offered little opportunity for advancement. A woman's best opportunity for climbing the ladder was working in one of the many department stores that had cropped up with the introduction of mass-produced goods. Some women could work their way up to become designers or buyers. More competitive fields included writing, dancing, acting, and singing. With all these options, though, the top 5 careers that employed most women were farm laborers, domestic servants, teachers, stenographers and typists, and non-store clerks, which was like admin work. One thing I learned that I found a bit humorous while researching this episode is about the iconic 1920s telephone and switchboard operators. Originally, they thought they'd hire teenage boys as operators, but when they proved to be too unruly and unreliable, they started offering the jobs to women instead. Good to know some things never change, I guess. I have 2 Patreon welcomes to share this month. Welcome to Michelle and Jennifer. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. I am so glad you're here. I recently made some updates to the Patreon tiers this season, where there are now 2 tiers that include additional content. If you've listened for a while, you've hopefully heard me speak about the Housekeeper and Butler tier on Patreon. That is the highest level of membership at $5 a month, and it's the one that includes bonus content for each episode, plus a new series called A Goodnight Snack. Keep your ears open and eyes on your regular podcast feed to hear episode previews for this new series. As of late, though, members in the $3 Ladies' Maid and Valette tier also have access to monthly bonus content. Both tiers include things like stickers, shoutouts, and more, so if that's something you may be interested in, please visit my website at agoodnightforamurder.com, where you can learn more about Patreon. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. need to start out this episode with a little bit of a history lesson and a science lesson. The best place to begin is in the year 1898 when Marie Curie and her husband Paul Curie discovered the element radium. At the time, they were building upon the work of Henry Becquerel, who discovered radioactivity through his experiments with another element, uranium. Upon its discovery, radium was treated as an amazing new cure-all. It was proclaimed a wonder drug and was prescribed in bottled water for everything from hay fever to gout to constipation. It was even powerful enough to shrink cancerous tumors. It was also touted as an untapped source of beauty and vitality and was added to food, toothpaste, cosmetics, and more. In 1906, an Austrian doctor who studied in Moscow named Dr. Sabin Arnold von Sachocki immigrated to the U.S. He practiced medicine for 10 years in New York, then moved to New Jersey. During the course of his work, Dr. von Sachocki invented a luminous paint formula that included radium. It should be noted that the radium in the paint did not glow on its own, but when mixed with another substance, zinc sulfide, the zinc sulfide would glow in response to the radioactivity emitted by the radium. So long as the two were together, the paint would continuously glow. In 1915, Dr. von Sachocki, along with Dr. George S. Willis and several other investors, founded the Radium Luminous Material Corporation. In 1916, they changed their name to the United States Radium Corporation, who I will refer to as the USRC throughout the rest of this episode. USRC operated carnotite ore mines in Colorado and Utah. They would extract the radium from this ore and use it to manufacture their special glowing paint that they branded as Undark. During this time, World War I was going on, and it was critical for soldiers to be able to know what time it was, not only during the daylight hours, but during the dark of night as well. Watches with ever-luminous faces were life-changing. As with most technologies pioneered for military use, the demand for these watches quickly expanded to civilian consumers, and the business of Undark was booming. USRC operated 3 plants during this time located in the cities of Newark, Jersey City, and Orange in New Jersey. The Orange location in particular employed nearly 300 workers, 70 of which were employed as dial painters. Dial painting was promoted as good work for women because of their small hands and light touch. And it was pretty good work by the day's standards. Averaging $20 per week, it paid more than 3 times the average factory job, placing dial painters in the top 5% of female earners in the country at that time. Being a dial painter was also a source of pride in one's community as the work was viewed as patriotic. Most girls were in their teens or early 20s and, once hired, would often refer their neighbors, cousins, and sisters to open positions. The job entailed mixing their own paint by scooping a small amount of radium powder into a crucible, adding a dash of water and a gum arabic adhesive, then using a fine camel hair brush to carefully paint the numbers onto paper watch faces, some of which were only 3.5 centimeters wide. To keep their brush to as fine a point as possible, the women were taught the dip lip paint routine, which meant dipping their brush in the radium paint, then placing it between their lips to point the bristles, then paint. And they would do this for each number on the watch face at the rate of 250 dials per day. While it was certainly hard work hunched over painting dials a day, there were other perks. Namely, the girls who worked as dial painters glowed. As the girls mixed the paint, the radium dust would get everywhere. It would settle on their hair and clothing, resulting in a soft, ethereal appearance that was envied by the girls working at other factories. Dial painters would often wear their best dresses to work, so when they went out dancing after their shift, they'd shimmer and glow in the dark. They'd even paint their nails and teeth with the stuff. To see them walking together down the street, glowing with an otherworldly presence, earned them the nickname Ghost Girls. One of the dial painters employed at USRC in Orange, New Jersey in 1917 was 20-year-old Amelia Maggia, who went by Molly. Molly, who was one of 7 girls in her family, would eventually refer 5 of her sisters to work with her at USRC. About 3 years into her employment, though, Molly started having some health problems that forced her to leave work. It started with a toothache. She went to the dentist, who told her they had to pull the tooth, which they did. But then it didn't heal, and the tooth next to it became infected as well. This happened several times over, and each treatment seemed to make the problem worse. The open wounds in her mouth constantly oozed blood and pus. The smell was terrible. She also started experiencing debilitating aches in her limbs. Her doctor told her that she had rheumatism and told her to take aspirin, but the pain just increased until she was no longer able to walk. Molly was only 24 years old at this point. It would get worse, though. The infections in her teeth spread to her jawbone and deteriorated the soft tissues in her mouth to the point that her dentist was simply able to lift what was left of her jawbone out of her face. She developed anemia from the bleeding until one day the weakened tissues in her jugular vein finally gave way and she bled out. Molly Maggia died at the age of 24 on September 12, 1922. Around the same time that Molly passed away, another girl named Grace Fryer, who had worked at USRC about the same length of time as Molly, left the company for a new job as a bank teller. Shortly thereafter, Grace started having trouble with her teeth as well, plus pain in her jaw, feet, and clouded vision. Her doctor was alarmed to find serious bone decay in her mouth, but could not find a reason for it. Then, two other dial painters, Helen Quinlan, age 21, and Irene Rudolph, age 22, both died from similar symptoms. What we know now that we did not know then was that the girls were suffering from radiation poisoning. When the body absorbs radiation, it treats it the same as calcium, meaning it gets sucked into our bones. Except instead of strengthening them like calcium would, the radium starts boring thousands of tiny holes in them. Words like honeycombed and moth-eaten is how doctors will later describe the bones of those afflicted. The radium stored in those bones would constantly emit radiation, gradually destroying bone marrow and blood cells. And since the girls were putting this stuff directly in their mouth as part of the dip lip paint routine, the first sign for many that something was wrong was that their teeth started to fall out. Once the problem teeth were removed, their bodies were already too weak to heal, and it was a steady, painful descent from there. In addition to crumbling teeth and jawbones, women suffered collapsed spines, painful swollen joints, tumors, unexplained weight loss, extreme exhaustion, brutal hemorrhaging, pregnancy complications, and worse. There is no cure or reversal for the effects of radiation poisoning. Now, even though I said that the medical and scientific community at large didn't really understand the dangers of being exposed to radium, some of them, actually many of them, did actually understand. The male lab technicians and scientists at USRC did take protective measures while working with radium, including wearing lead aprons and handling samples with ivory-tipped tongs. Despite this, when reports began to roll in of their workers becoming ill, USRC pressured doctors to say the women were dying of syphilis, a sexually transmitted infection that was rather widespread at the time. They 100% did this to refuse responsibility for the women's illness and to shame and embarrass them into silence. Even so, in March of 1924, the company conducted a covert internal investigation led by Harvard physician Cecil Drinker. 3 months later, Drinker presented his findings to USRC, which were: the radium was for sure making the dial painter sick, every member of the workforce had unusual blood specimens, and the entire plant was contaminated with radiation. He also provided a long but reasonable list of safety precautions he recommended the company put in place immediately. Higher-ups at USRC were pissed. They wholly rejected Drinker's findings, buried the report, and submitted a fraudulent report to the Labor Department as evidence that they were in no way culpable for the women's illnesses. A colleague of Drinker's, Alice Hamilton, somehow discovered that the report USRC submitted to the Labor Department was not the report Drinker had written, and she encouraged him to publish his findings independently, which he did. This really pissed off USRC, and they threatened him up and down with legal action, but Drinker published a report anyway. Around this time, in addition to several other women, USRC's chief chemist, Dr. Edwin E. Lehman, died, with the same symptoms all the women who died prior to him had. And now that a man had died, officials finally took notice. County physician of Newark, Dr. Harrison Martland, took up the cause to investigate the link between dial painting and radium poisoning. He was joined by none other than Dr. Seben Arnold von Suchocki, the inventor of radium paint himself. At one time, Dr. von Suchocki had said, "The time will doubtless come when you will have in your own house a room lighted entirely by radium. The light thrown off by the radium paint on walls and ceiling would in color and tone be like soft moonlight." But in recent years, von Suchocki had to leave the company to tend to his failing health. He was suffering pain and stiffness in his hands caused by necrosis due to handling radium, as well as jaw and teeth problems. The work of Martland, von Suchocki, and another doctor, Dr. Joseph Neff, directly linked the use of radium paint to the debilitating deadly symptoms experienced by the dial painters. What's more, they also learned that once radium found its way into the body, the damage was permanent, there was no way to get it out, and it would continue unchecked to wreak havoc on the body. The effects of the poison were slow, though, taking an average of about 5 years to build up before the effects could be noticed. And the company used this to its advantage, saying it couldn't possibly be the radium. They'd been using the stuff for years, and they'd always been fine. The damage had started on day one, though, so by the time symptoms started to crop up, the girls were pretty much doomed. Sometimes the first sign a girl would have that she would indeed fall victim to radiation poisoning was when she would glimpse herself in the mirror at night and notice a faint glow of their skin or bones. Around this time, Grace Fryer received a second opinion from another doctor confirming her health problems were linked to her previous employment as a dial painter. Grace, who was the daughter of a union representative, came to the sad realization that she herself was already too far gone, but for the sake of all the other girls out there, she decided to sue USRC. By now, it was 1926, and it would be 2 whole years before Grace could find a lawyer willing to take on the case against USRC. Unfortunately, the women were up against a statute of limitations which said that victims of occupational poisoning had to bring their legal cases within 2 years. Remember, it took most victims a total of 5 years to recognize their symptoms as radium poisoning. In 1927, though, Grace did find a lawyer named Raymond Berry who was willing to accept the case. Former women would join Grace in the suit, including Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and sisters Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice. Quinta and Albina were sisters of Molly Maggia, who had lost her life back in 1922. Remember, 6 of the 7 Maggia sisters were employed by USRC as dial painters. Berry filed the suit seeking $250,000 each in damages. That is about $4 million in today's money. A total of 4 girls would be exhumed as part of the lawsuit investigation, including Molly Maggia. An autopsy would find that every sample of bone and tissue showed extremely high levels of radioactivity. However, these tests were hardly needed as even 5 years after her death, Molly Maggia still glowed. USRC responded by doing nothing. It was clear that their tactic was to drag the proceedings out in court so much that the women would just die before they had a chance to even have the case heard. And for USRC, it was a good tactic because at this rate, that was exactly what was going to happen. By the time the case reached court in January of 1928, the women's health had rapidly deteriorated. 2 of the women were bedridden, including Grace, who required a back brace to sit up, and all were too weak to even raise their arms to take the oath. The press dubbed them the Radio Girls, and news of their story spread around the globe. Marie Curie herself said, "I would only be too happy to give any aid that I could," adding, "There is absolutely no means of destroying the substance once it enters the human body." The next hearing would be 3 months later in April, but at this point, all of the women were too sick to appear. Despite fears that the woman would not survive to see the trial through coming to fruition, the judge decided to adjourn until September the same year. Walter Lippmann, the editor of the New York World newspaper, called the judge's decision a damnable travesty of justice. He went on to say, "There is no possible excuse for such a delay. The women are dying. If ever a case called for prompt adjunction, it is the case of 5 crippled women who are fighting for a few miserable dollars to ease their last days on earth." In a later editorial, he wrote, "This is a heartless proceeding. It is unmanly, unjust, and cruel. This is a case which calls not for fine-spun litigation, but for simple, quick, direct justice." Things were bleak from the start, but as the weeks and months crept by, the desperate situation that women were in became even more painfully obvious. Days before the trial date, Berry and the Radium Girls and USRC agreed to allow U.S. District Court Judge William Clark to mediate an out-of-court settlement. It would eventually come to light that Judge William Clark was actually a stockholder in USRC. I'm not sure if they knew this at the time or if they found out later, but either way, the girls were on borrowed time as it was, and they had to move forward. The settlement for each of the 5 Radium Girls was $10,000 and a $600 annuity paid at $12 per week for the rest of their lives, and all medical and legal expenses incurred would also be paid by the company. Today, that would amount to $177,000 and a $10,600 annuity paid at $200 per week. In return, United States Radium Corporation would be absolved of all legal responsibility. During the trial, they had actually been forced to close down operations at the plant in Orange, New Jersey, where the girls had worked. They ended up having to lease the building and sell off other properties before consolidating operations nearby in Manhattan. In November of that year, Dr. Sibin Arnold von Suchocki died at the age of 45 at the hands of his very own invention. In the course of his treatment, he had undergone 11 to 13 blood transfusions. His cause of death was ruled as aplastic anemia, which is when your bone marrow can no longer make enough healthy blood cells for your body to function. The fortune he made from the invention of radium paint had been completely depleted by his lengthy medical treatments at the time of his death. Molly Maggia's sister, Quinta, died in December of 1929 at the age of 29. Next was Catherine Schaub in February of 1933 at the age of 31. That same year, Grace Fryer passed away in October at the age of 34. Edna Hussman died in March of 1939 at the age of 37, and the third Maggie's sister, Albina, would become the last survivor of the New Jersey Radium Girls before she passed away in November of 1946 at the age of 51. It's estimated that a total of 30 people died as a result of radium exposure from USRC. Now, notice how I said the New Jersey Radium Girls. Our story is not over. Near identical events actually played out at 2 more locations in the United States, one being in the city of Ottawa, Illinois. Another radium dial painting company was in operation there named Radium Dial Company, or RDC for short. RDC was a division of the Standard Chemical Company based in the Marshall Field Annex building in Chicago. They opened up their dial painting business around the same time as USRC was getting underway in 1917. In 1922, RDC moved into a former high school building at 1022 Columbus Street in Ottawa, where they would produce around 4,000 dials a day. Around 1926 to 1927 is when RDC started having much of the same problems that USRC was having with their workers, asking for compensation for their medical bills. RDC, of course, did everything they could not to pay them, though. Workers in Illinois were unaware of the struggles in New Jersey until news of the lawsuit against USRC broke. Dial painter Catherine Wolfe Donahue remembered, "There were meetings at our plant that bordered on riots. The chill of fear was so depressing that we could scarcely work." But, surprise, surprise, RDC management claimed the substance causing all of the problems for the New Jersey dial painters was something called mesothorium, which they did not use. So everything was fine and get back to work. Management knew this was a bald-faced lie, though, and introduced small changes, hoping that would be enough to avoid any trouble. One change was replacing the brushes and lip point technique with a fine-tipped glass pen. However, the workers found it slowed their productivity, and since they were getting paid per the number of dials they painted, they quickly reverted to using the brushes and lip point technique. Meanwhile, medical tests conducted on employees showed rampant levels of radiation, though the results were never shared with the employees themselves. When the girls began to die, RDC went so far as to steal the girls' bones so they could not be tested during an autopsy. In 1935, having become fully aware of the story of the New Jersey Radium Girls, the Illinois workers decided to sue. Catherine Wolfe Donahue, who I quoted before, led the charge along with 4 other women. By now, though, the country was in the grip of the Great Depression, one of the worst economic downturns ever seen. Catherine and the other girls were shunned from their communities for trying to take down one of the few businesses left standing where one could still earn a little bit of money. In 1937 and 1938, the women were represented pro bono by Leonard Grossman in front of the Illinois Industrial Commission. Against her doctor's advice, Catherine used her last ounce of strength to give her testimony from her deathbed. By this time, she'd lost all of her teeth as well as parts of her jaw. She constantly held a handkerchief to her mouth to absorb the blood and infection that oozed forth, and she had developed a grapefruit-sized tumor on her hip. At the time of her testimony, however, RDC had actually closed its Ottawa plant and claimed the company was defunct. So it wasn't their problem, as there was no RDC to be held accountable. Fortunately, the Illinois Industrial Commission wasn't having it, and in spring of 1938 ruled in favor of the women. A few months later, Catherine died at the age of 35, leaving behind her husband, a 5-year-old son, and 4-year-old daughter. Catherine, as well as another dial painter, Peg Looney, would be buried in lead-lined caskets to contain the radiation emanating from their bodies. The RDC would go on to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court in October of 1939, but the court decided not to hear the case and upheld the ruling of the lower courts. I don't know why they had this many appeals, but the case of the Illinois Radium Girls was won 8 times over before the Radium Dial Company was finally forced to pay up. Similar events were also playing out at a third location that never seems to get as much mention as those in New Jersey and Illinois, and that was the Waterbury Clock Company in Waterbury, Connecticut. They employed women's dial painters the same as USRC and RDC using the lip point method. In 1925, a worker named Frances Spletchotter died with symptoms of radium poisoning at the age of 21. This was around the same time that Grace Fryer had started making waves with her lawsuit in New Jersey. Like the other companies, Waterbury knew what was going on, but they weren't about to tell their workers that. Instead, they told them, okay, just don't put the stuff in your mouth anymore, and you'll be fine. They officially discouraged the lip point technique and hired a doctor to look after the health of the girls. However, the doctor was a fraud paid by the company to assuage the girls' fears. Despite repeatedly assuring them they were fine, the company would end up being on the hook for a total of $90,000 in medical settlements between the years 1926 and 1936. The only thing this made them change, though, was to reduce the number of years the women had to file a medical claim through workers' comp from 5 years to 3 years. And we already talked about how it could take an average of 5 years for symptoms of poisoning to surface. This was not true in all cases, though. Some girls were dead within a year or two of starting work at the Waterbury Clock Company. In 1929, 22-year-old Mildred Cardell died from working with radium. The next year, Mary DeMollis, also in her early 20s, died due to lip pointing. One girl, May Keene, actually credits the lip pointing technique with saving her life, though. May worked at Waterbury for a summer job at the age of 19 in 1925. She disliked the taste of the radium paint. She said it tasted bitter, and she refused to lip point the brushes as they were instructed. This, of course, slowed her productivity, for which she was fired. Though she escaped with her life, she did lose all of her teeth by the time she was in her late 30s. It was the mid-1930s before Waterbury officially banned lip pointing in their factory. Due to rising employee concerns, they agreed to raise the dial painters' wages by 2 cents as a sort of hazard pay, I suppose. Ultimately, exposure to radium at Waterbury would lead to over 30 deaths. During World War II, Waterbury Clock Company became the largest producer of fuse timers for precision defense products in the United States and built a new plant in Middlebury, Connecticut. This is likely when they stopped using the original building on Cherry Street. I was unable to find out what it was used for in the interim, but in about 1978, it was converted to low-income apartments for the elderly, now called the Enterprise Apartments. Fast forward 2 decades later, Ross Molnar, an associate professor of public health at the University of Illinois, was writing a book about the Radium Girls called Deadly Glow. During his research, it became apparent that no one seemed to know that the Enterprise Apartments on Cherry Street was in fact the old Waterbury Clock Company factory. This was alarming. He contacted the Department of Environmental Protection, who was also not aware. They thought, hey, we better get out there, and confirmed traces of radium in 5 apartments, as well as the offices and a leather clothier on site. Some tenants had to be evacuated while their apartments were cleaned by crews in hazmat gear, but 2004 officially marked the end of cleanup efforts. Today, it's still apartments. If you want to see them, I included a link to the rental listings in the episode blog on my website. Eventually, Waterbury Clock Company became Timex. In 2001, they would open the Time Expo Museum in Waterbury, Connecticut, which was dedicated to the history of Timex Group and its predecessors, featuring exhibits dating back to the founding of Waterbury Clock Company in 1854. However, several sources I consulted pointed out that their museum completely neglected to acknowledge the existence of the 30-plus women who died from radium poisoning while under their employ. A 2004 article on the matter stated, Jim Katz, Timex's communication director, said the company had no comment on the matter. Whatever happened took place a long time before I got to Timex, Katz said. Despite Mr. Katz having nothing to say, I actually feel he said a whole lot with that statement. Anyway, the museum closed in 2015 due to low attendance. Too bad, so sad. What became of the Orange and Ottawa sites, though? While the plant in Orange did close during the trial, radium dial painting did go on well into the 1960s at other locations. The demand for luminescent products increased again during World War II, and by 1944, USRC employed as many as 1,000 workers across mining, processing, and application facilities spread across the U.S., including Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, Bernardsville, New Jersey, Whippany, New Jersey, North Hollywood, California, and New York City. However, following the lawsuit, dial painters were instructed in proper safety precautions and provided with protective gear, after which there were no more deaths attributed to radium poisoning. It was that easy. In 1954, radium mining in Canada stopped and supplies became too expensive to support all of their locations. USRC consolidated its operations to Morristown, New Jersey, and South Center Township east of Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. About 15 years later, USRC ceased radium processing altogether, spinning off those operations as Nuclear Radiation Development Corporation, LLC, based in Grand Island, New York. The following year, a new facility at the Bloomsburg plant opened dedicated to manufacturing glow-in-the-dark exit and aircraft signs using tritium, which is another substance with a relatively low source of beta radiation that is too weak to penetrate the skin. Anyway, from here, it split and merged and split into a bunch of different companies. Back to our original question, though, what happened to the Orange, New Jersey location that was poisoning everybody? From Wikipedia, the company processed about 1,000 pounds of ore daily while in operation, which was dumped on the site. The radon and radiation resulting from the 1,600 tons of material on the abandoned factory resulted in the site's designation as a Superfund site by the United States Environmental Protection Agency in 1983. From 1997 through 2005, the EPA remediated the site in a process that involved the excavation and offsite disposal of radium-contaminated material at the former plant site and at 250 residential and commercial properties that had been contaminated in the intervening decades. In 2009, the EPA wrapped up their long-running Superfund cleanup effort. Today, the exact building location appears to be a park that opened in 2019 with soccer and baseball fields, a walking path, and children's playground. In Ottawa, Illinois, remember that the owners of Radium Dial Company tried to say they went out of business, which they did. But they reopened another company under the same management literally up the road called Luminous Processes, Inc., or LPI. The owner promised safer working conditions and banned lip pointing, but they literally learned nothing from the previous lawsuits. At LPI, radioactive waste was emptied into toilets, ventilation shafts were discharged near a children's playground, employees worked in unvented rooms and wore smocks that they laundered at home, and left work covered in radioactive dust that they tracked all over town. The owners, again, lied to their employees, insisting the lip pointing was the problem, and now that that was over, everyone would be fine. They were not fine, and more people did get sick and die. Numerous other businesses came and went in different parts of the building, including a meat locker company operating out of the basement. One resident later stated, "I knew many families that bought meat there, and at least one person in every family later got cancer." Somewhere between 1968 and 1978, federal inspectors finally shut the building down, detecting levels of radiation that were over 1,600 times what was considered to be safe. In 1985, what was then the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety oversaw the demolition, packaging, and disposal of the radium-contaminated debris. Most of the debris was transported to a disposal site in Hanford, Washington, but local residents said otherwise. They saw the radioactive rubble being used as fill all over town. They built playgrounds, schools, and municipal buildings out of it. In 1986, the U.S. Department of Energy conducted an aerial radiological survey and identified abnormal radiation levels at numerous locations throughout the city and surrounding areas. They identified 14 areas with radium contamination that were later listed as EPA Superfund sites. Today, the cleanup of 11 of the 14 sites has been completed. That's right, they're still working on it. They're still trying to clean up this mess. Ottawa seems to be the only location, though, that has not entirely tried to sweep their dark history under the rug. And that's thanks to a girl named Madeline Pillar, who was an 8th grade student in Ottawa in 2006. She was shocked that hardly anyone knew what had happened in their own hometown and lobbied to erect a Radium Girl memorial. She worked with local unions to provide funds and elevate their costs to local politicians. Madeline's father, sculptor William Pillar, was hired to create a life-size bronze statue of a Radium Girl, which was unveiled in 2011. The memorial that depicts a 1920s dial painter stands in a plaza on the site of the former LPI factory. It's dedicated to the working women of the Radium Dial Company, Luminous Process Inc., and all dial painters who suffered. Thank you, Madeline. Overall, the lawsuit, battles, and publicity brought by the Radium Girls played a significant factor in the establishment of occupational disease labor law. In 1968, the Center for Human Radiobiology was established at Argonne National Laboratory in Lemont, Illinois. For decades after, over 2,000 surviving dial painters came to the center for bone marrow biopsies, blood tests, x-rays, and physical exams. One source states, they filled out questionnaires about their mental and physical health, took breath tests, and had their body radium measured in the iron rooms below the earth. Autopsies were performed in some. Some women were stricken early, then endured a half-life for decades. One girl was bedridden for over 50 years. Many suffered significant bone changes and fractures. Many lost their teeth. Many developed bone cancer, leukemia, and anemia. Some were given blood transfusions for years. Some developed osteoporosis with collapsed vertebrae requiring multiple operations. Many had amputations. The project ended in 1993, and the contribution of the women to medical science is immeasurable. Now, on to some important follow-up questions. You may have heard that the Radium Girls are still glowing in their caskets to this day, and if you bring a Geiger counter, you can still detect radiation while standing over their graves. So, let's break this down. First, do they still glow? When I first heard this story, I actually lost sleep thinking about this. But after my research for this episode, I now know that it's unlikely the girls' remains are still glowing. Even the glow from radium will cease a few years to a few decades later. This means that most who were contaminated enough to glow in the first place have likely stopped glowing. So I can sleep better at night now that I know that. Just because they have stopped glowing, though, does not mean they have stopped emitting radiation. One source explained, The half-life of a radioactive element is the length of time it takes for about 50% of a sample of any given size to decay. For radium, that's 1,602 years. I'm not a chemist, but what I think this means is that the level of radioactivity will decrease by half approximately every 1,600 years. And the girls have only been gone for about 100 years. So yes, they are still radioactive down there. I mentioned earlier that at least 2 dial painters from Ottawa, Peg Looney and Catherine Wolfe Donahue, were buried in lead-lined caskets to contain the radiation. But so far as the others, can you still detect radiation at their graves? I have an answer for you on that as well. About 2 years ago, a friend and I, shout out to Katie, were able to borrow a legit Geiger counter, not one like purchased on Amazon, and we set out to find the graves of the Radium Girls in New Jersey. We were able to find the graves of Molly Maggia and Grace Fryer, and we detected 0 elevation of radiation at each site. And we really tried to. We swept the entire area to see if there was even a little bit of a rise in radiation anywhere around the grave. We tested the Geiger counter over and over to see if it was functioning properly. And in the end, we did not detect any level of radiation above normal at either of the graves. I linked to a few sources in the episode blog on my website of those who conducted their own investigations over the graves, and none of them ever got any elevated radiation readings either. It would likely be a different story if the graves were ever opened, but so far as detecting radiation at the gravesite, I'm satisfied that has been debunked. Even Marie Curie, who died in 1934 and was exhumed in 1995 to be transferred to the National Mausoleum, reportedly only emitted small levels of alpha and beta contamination. So after all this, you may be curious how we make glow-in-the-dark things today. The glow-in-the-dark we see in children's toys and other objects today is a phosphorus glow, not a radium glow. Remember, radium on its own does not glow. It's other substances that are reacting to the radiation emitted from the radium, and their reaction is to glow. Phosphorus glow works kind of the same way, except it doesn't require exposure to radiation to glow. Those substances can glow by reacting to light. 2 common and completely safe substances that work that way are called zinc sulfide and strontium aluminate. If you hold these objects up to a light source to charge up, they'll glow faintly for a few minutes to a few hours before slowly fading. Super safe. Now, there are some products out there, like high-end watches, where the watch faces will still glow continuously, even though they're not charged by light. These use a substance called tritium, which is what the company that was once USRC turned to using eventually. As mentioned before, tritium emits a different kind of radiation that is too weak to penetrate the skin and has a much, much shorter half-life than radium. There is another man-made substance called promethium that works much in the same way. In the cases of both these substances, they're perfectly safe to use and wear so long as you don't literally eat your watch. Speaking of things not to do with watches though, there were thousands of radium dial watches made, and if you happen to acquire a vintage watch made between the 1910s and 1960s, there's a good chance it's a radium dial paint watch, even if it doesn't glow anymore. Though many have been refaced with safer material, remember that just because the glow has faded doesn't mean it's not still radioactive. There are a lot of articles and videos online to help you determine if a watch is indeed a radium dial, and I encourage you to do your own research to determine the best method of identification. I will tell you, though, that collectors and experts generally do not freak out over the handling of radium paint watches. According to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, radioactive antiques, including watches, are not usually a health risk as long as they are intact and in good condition. From Wikipedia, though, it is of the utmost importance that watches with radium dials should not be taken apart without proper training, etiquette, and facilities. My friends, that is everything I know, and now you know about the Radium Girls. I really went down a lot of rabbit holes researching this important story, and I hope I did them justice. I did experience some interesting synchronicities while learning about the Radium Girls. They're more so personal stories, so I'll be sharing those on my social media channels, so if you don't already follow me there, please do so. If you head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know what you think about this story and see some of the photos of some of the products made with radium, the girls themselves, and more. You can also see the photos and source links for this episode on the episode blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. While you're on the website, you can sign up for the Good Night for a Murder newsletter. Each month, I send an episode roundup, reveal of next month's episodes, and other goodies like extra Victorian Society tips, book recommendations, and more. The bonus content available on Patreon for this episode is another landmark story of women banding together to fight for workplace rights. I'll be covering the 1888 story of the Matchstick Girls. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. To subscribe to Patreon and learn more about the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also, follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. And to accompany episode 44 about the Radium Girls, I'm going to tell you about another landmark story of women banding together to fight for workplace rights. This is the story of the Matchstick Girls. In Britain in 1843, English Quakers William Bryant and Frances May owned a business trading in general merchandise. In 1850, the pair entered into a business relationship with a Swedish matchmaking company. Britain used approximately 250 million matches a day, and they wanted a piece of the pie. In 1861, the Bryant and May matchmaking business was relocated to a 3-acre site on Fairfield Road in Bow, East London. On nearby Bow Common, the company built a lumber mill to make splints from imported Canadian pine. Initially, Bryant and May only manufactured what were called safety matches. The alternative were a type of match called lucifers, like the devil. And being Quaker, Bryant and May wanted to steer clear of anything having to do with that guy. The difference between the older style of lucifers and safety matches was that lucifers were made with white phosphorus, sometimes called yellow phosphorus, and safety matches were made with red phosphorus. The lucifers incorporated white phosphorus directly in the match head, allowing them to be lit by striking on any surface. They got their name due to the use of sulfur in their production. Sulfur was also called brimstone. Fire and brimstone is associated with hell and the devil. The devil's name is Lucifer. Lucifer matches. And this is how all matches were made up until about the 1840s when they discovered red phosphorus. Then, instead of including phosphorus in the match head, they included the red phosphorus in a strike strip on the matchbox to ignite the match. This is what we're familiar with today. However, red phosphorus was more expensive than white, so they had to charge more for them. People preferred the more inexpensive lucifers, so by 1880, Bryant and May had started making them as well. Lucifer matches were made by dipping matchsticks of poplar or Canadian pine into sulfur, then into a mixture of white phosphorus, potassium chlorate, antimony sulfide, powdered glass, and coloring. The percentage of white phosphorus in a match was reported to be anywhere between 5 to 10%. Experienced workers could finish 1,400 frames in a 10-hour shift, which created 10 million matches. The operation itself, though, was a sweatshop. Sweatshops became a thing from about 1830 to 1850, drawing immigrants and unskilled laborers into the cities. Labor laws and unions to improve worker rights existed, but they were in their early stages, and most employers fought them every step of the way. By the 1880s, Bryant and May employed nearly 5,000 people. 1,200 to 1,500 of those were women and girls, mostly between the ages of 13 and 20. The working conditions were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, rodent-infested, and prone to fires. The workers were paid varying rates for different jobs, though all were painfully underpaid. Shifts were 10 to 14 hours long, and a worker rarely took home their full wages, as a number of fines were levied against them by the foreman every day. These included having an untidy workbench, talking, being late, having a burnt match on their workbench, or having dirty feet. Most workers couldn't even afford shoes. Workers were also responsible for supplying many of their own tools, such as string, brushes, or paste. Also, the work was dangerous. Aside from the numerous ways to be injured due to slipshod safety practices and rapid spread of disease due to overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, there was another danger present in the matchmaking factory, which was the occupational disease of phossy jaw. Phossy jaw was a condition directly attributed to working with white phosphorus without proper safety precautions. White phosphorus is very toxic when inhaled or ingested. Workers were constantly exposed to phosphorus vapor and would come into contact with it through their skin from handling